Close your eyes for just a second and listen closely. Hear those shift whistles screaming across the river, those heavy factory doors slamming shut, and that low, steady roar of thousands of workers all moving at once. That was Detroit, in the middle of the 20th century, a city that genuinely sounded like money being made. And for 2 whole decades, it truly was the richest city in America.
For this video, I used AI to pull together those years and the stories so you can see exactly how it happened, so stick with me right to the end.
Before we jump into the timeline, you need to know what rich actually looked like in Detroit. It looked like a packed streetcar rolling home after the afternoon shift. It looked like a crowded diner at midnight serving auto workers coming off the line. It looked like a paycheck that covered more than just the basics, at least for some families. Researchers have described Detroit as a long-running economic powerhouse, a place of unusual prosperity built on innovation and manufacturing muscle. The city knew how to combine capital and labor to produce mechanical goods at a scale nobody else could match. That is the mood behind the title, America's Richest City. But comfort was never distributed equally, and that tension runs through every year of this story. Our story begins on December 29, 1940, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat and used 4 words that would define Detroit for a generation: weapons, planes, tanks, and ships. He called America the arsenal of democracy. Detroit's historical record explains that the city became permanently tied to that phrase because its manufacturing strength and automobile industry could rapidly shift into producing war vehicles and equipment. In plain language, Detroit was already preparing to make the war long before America had officially entered it. The factories were ready, the workforce was ready, and the city was about to enter the most transformative decade in its history. In 1941, Detroit's war story became a road story. Construction began that year on the Davison Freeway, partly because the defense plants needed better access, and city officials rushed the project forward. Detroit was literally redesigning its own layout so that people and materials could move faster. When a city is building highways in the middle of a world war, it tells you something important. The jobs were flowing, the money was flowing, and the whole place was reshaping itself in real time to meet the moment. By early 1942, the auto industry stopped being about family sedans and became about military hardware. On January 16, 1942, the War Production Board was created to coordinate the national war effort. Just over a month later, on February 22, 1942, all American manufacturers ended civilian automobile production entirely. In Detroit, that meant passenger car lines disappearing overnight and being rebuilt to produce tanks, trucks, bombers, and ammunition. Later that same year, on November 25, 1942, the Davison Freeway officially opened to traffic. It was described as the first urban below-grade freeway in the United States, and it marked Detroit as a city that was not just making the war, but also reinventing its own infrastructure at breakneck speed. But all that wartime production came with a darker side. On June 20, 1943, a conflict that began at Belle Isle Park spread into the city and escalated into what became known as the Detroit Race Riot. Nearly 100,000 people had been at Belle Isle that day, and rumors pushed both black and white communities into fear and violence that rapidly widened across the entire city. The final toll was 34 people killed, 9 white and 25 black, and federal troops had to arrive to restore order. This year matters because it shows something crucial. Detroit's prosperity and Detroit's tension were living on the exact same streets at the exact same time, and pretending otherwise would miss the whole story. Detroit stayed locked in war mode through 1944. The city's industrial identity was built on constant shifts and constant transport, and the auto industry remained completely transitioned. Meanwhile, housing pressure and workplace racism were still part of daily life for black workers, which meant that booming did not feel the same in every neighborhood. White workers often had clearer paths to advancement, while black workers faced discrimination even as they fueled the war effort alongside everyone else. 1944 was a year of steady production and steady pressure, operating at the same time. When the war ended in 1945, Detroit did not relax. It rebalanced. Civilian car, truck, and auto parts production had halted from February 1942 to October 1945, so the shift back to peacetime manufacturing was a long, complicated gear change. Workers wanted jobs that would last, and they wanted the consumer boom they had been promised during the war, especially cars and housing for families and returning veterans. Detroit's identity as America's wealth engine was now pointing back toward consumer demand, and that demand would become the next great driver of growth. Detroit's wealth story has always been a labor story, and 1946 made that undeniable. A massive strike against General Motors ran from November 21, 1945 through March 13, 1946, lasting 113 days and involving 320,000 workers. In a factory city like Detroit, those dates mattered enormously. The strike showed how wages got negotiated and how union bargaining had become a national economic issue. When it finally ended, the settlement reinforced a powerful new idea. Middle-class life in America depended on organized labor being able to sit across the table from management and demand its share. By 1947, the war was over, but the housing crisis was not going anywhere. Returning veterans needed homes, factories kept hiring, and Detroit's neighborhoods were bursting at the seams. City leaders began announcing early versions of what they called the Detroit Plan, contemplating large-scale urban renewal and slum clearance even before the mid-1950s freeway projects broke ground. Then on May 3, 1948, the United States Supreme Court decided the case of Shelley v. Kramer, ruling that courts could no longer enforce racially restrictive housing covenants. This decision did not erase segregation overnight, but it mattered enormously because neighborhood boundaries were no longer being propped up by the legal system in the same way. In a city already under severe housing pressure, that kind of legal shift felt like a threat to some families and an open door to others. 1948 helps explain why Detroit's wealth was never shared simply or evenly. On July 15, 1949, President Harry Truman signed the Housing Act of 1949, a sweeping piece of federal legislation that would reshape American cities for decades. Detroit was already lining up local redevelopment plans and acquiring land when this national policy arrived, and the two fit together in ways that would transform the city. 1949 set the stage for everything that came next. In the 1950s, the word improvement in Detroit would often mean demolition, and highways combined with redevelopment would reshape exactly who got to live close to the good jobs. In 1950, Detroit was packed with almost 1.85 million people, the fifth biggest city in America, basically a whole nation squeezed inside its own borders. That May, the UAW and General Motors signed the Treaty of Detroit, a landmark deal that lifted wages, created pensions after 25 years, and handed workers company-paid health care. By 1951, that contract was already reshaping family life, making steady work feel like real security, with median family income around $4,600. But here's the twist. Mayor Albert Cobo was pushing policies that hardened racial segregation, and the suburbs were quietly pulling ahead in wealth. So one line captures it all. Money was rising fast, and walls were rising right alongside it. By 1952, inflation was already biting hard into working families, and union leader Walter Reuther demanded the labor contracts be reopened, calling them living documents because rising prices were eating into real wages. This tells you everything about Detroit's wealth in one clean example. It was strong, but it leaned entirely on production staying high and prices staying in check. Then, in May 1953, after months of pressure and disruption, the union actually won that reopening fight. And look, higher wages are not just numbers on paper. They show up as groceries on the table, rent paid on time, and a doctor's visit for a sick kid. Detroit felt rich because workers could still push back and genuinely win. 1954 felt calm on the surface. Detroit was still huge, still busy, still confident that factory wages could build a genuinely good life. But behind the scenes, city planners were already finalizing maps that would tear whole communities apart. Across Detroit's urban renewal push, roughly 10,000 buildings were eventually demolished, and about 43,000 people were displaced, around 70% of them Black. Modernization had finally arrived, and it came with a brutal price tag. On June 29, 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, kicking off what became the biggest public works project in American history. For Detroit, highways were never just neutral concrete. More roads meant more cars, more commerce, but they also sliced right through neighborhoods and made it easy for jobs and families to drift outward. Then came 1957, the absolute peak. Median family income in Greater Detroit hit $6,200, and thousands of families felt genuinely secure. Picture the confidence of planning a summer road trip instead of barely scraping through the month. But here's the quiet crack. The suburbs were already gaining ground faster than the city itself. Wealth was quietly packing its bags. Then the recession hit, and it hit hard. Median family income dropped to $5,900 in 1958. While prices kept climbing, actual buying power just collapsed. And here's the ugly part. Black families took steeper losses than white families, meaning the pain was never shared evenly. Then came 1959, a stunning split-screen moment. Construction of Interstate 375 moved forward and effectively killed Hastings Street, the main business corridor of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, two of the most culturally vibrant Black neighborhoods in the entire country. But on January 12th, that same year, a young songwriter named Berry Gordy Jr. started Tamla Records with an $800 family loan. That tiny beginning became Motown. Detroit lost a beloved street and gained a global cultural engine on the very same calendar page. Detroit's wealth in the 1940s and 1950s is easiest to understand as a chain reaction. Wartime production created urgency and jobs. Post-war consumer demand created massive sales. The income data showed the suburbs pulling ahead even before the decade ended, hinting that wealth was already migrating outward. Detroit felt rich because in many real ways it was rich. But the story of how that wealth was built and who got a share in it is one of the most important stories America has ever told about itself.
Thanks for riding along with me through Old Detroit. If this pulled you in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe.
And drop a comment telling me which city or era you want to explore next. See you next time.